Welcome to the All Sorts podcast on YouTube, where we like to explore some of the poetic beauty of the unseen world.
Yeah.
Hit that like button, subscribe, share this with your friends.
Yes.
And for all you curious listeners out there, we are going to be talking about Darwin wasps today.
Yes. Ichneumonidae. We're diving deep into some of the research today. Specifically, we're looking at the biology and taxonomy of these really incredible insects.
It's so interesting, right? Because you see like the big charismatic megafauna.
Yeah.
And you think, oh, those are the interesting animals.
Yeah.
But then you realize that there are so many creatures out there that are small,
Right.
but just as important to the world and to the ecosystem.
In fact, arguably much more important.
Yeah?
I mean, especially when you consider the sheer number
Right.
of these creatures.
So what is it about Darwin wasps that makes them so interesting to study?
Well, first of all, they're incredibly diverse. The family Ichneumonidae is one of the most species-rich families in the order Hymenoptera, which is the order that includes all the bees and ants and sawflies and wasps.
Okay.
Over 25,000 described species,
Wow.
over 1,600 genera, and 41 subfamilies.
That's huge.
It is huge. And within that family, there's just an incredible diversity of life history, strategies, and morphology and behavior.
Wow. So within those subfamilies,
Yeah.
are there any in particular that stand out as being especially diverse?
Well, the subfamily Pimplinae is
Okay.
definitely one of the richest, with about 1,700 described species and about 79 genera.
Okay. And what is it that makes that particular subfamily so diverse?
That's a great question, and I don't know if we have the answer to that yet.
Okay.
But there is some research, for example, in the Brazilian Atlantic rainforest
Yeah.
that has shown really high species richness of Pimplinae wasps
Okay.
compared to other similar studies, and they collected 98 morphospecies
Oh, wow.
along just one elevational gradient on one mountain.
So they found that many different kinds of Darwin wasps in one place.
In one place.
That's incredible.
Yeah.
And how does that compare to like the diversity of Darwin wasps
Yeah.
in other parts of the world?
Well, that's a great question. And there's been some debate about whether or not Ichneumonidae follow the typical latitudinal richness gradient
Right.
that you see in most other organisms, where you find more species closer to the equator.
Right.
Some people have argued that there's actually an inverse gradient with
Right.
Ichneumonidae, where you actually find more species at higher latitudes.
Interesting. So the opposite of what you'd expect.
Yeah, the opposite of what you'd expect.
Oh.
However, there's been some research that has contradicted that.
Okay.
For example, there was a study in lowland Peruvian Amazonia
Yeah.
that showed really high tropical richness.
Great.
And there's also a study in southeastern Brazil that
Okay.
showed the same thing. So it's starting to look like maybe Ichneumonidae do follow the typical latitudinal richness gradient after all.
Okay. So it's just that maybe we just haven't been looking in the right places yet.
Yeah, that's possible.
It could be that we just haven't fully explored
Yeah,
tropical areas yet to find all the different species that might be there.
exactly. And that kind of ties back to that Brazilian study where
Yeah.
they found so many species on one mountain.
Right.
They found in just 6 months as many species as have been found in the entire British Isles
Oh.
ever, which is pretty amazing.
Yeah.
It's 109 species.
So that suggests that the tropics really are a hotspot for Darwin wasp diversity.
Absolutely.
Okay. So we've talked about the diversity of Darwin wasps, but let's get into their biology a little bit.
Okay.
What is it about their biology that makes them so unique?
Well, the defining characteristic of Ichneumonidae is that they are parasitoids.
Parasitoid.
They reproduce by parasitizing other insects and spiders.
Okay. So how does that work?
Well, essentially, the female wasp will lay her eggs either on or inside another insect or spider.
Okay.
And then when the larva hatches, it feeds on its host and eventually kills it.
Wow.
Yeah. It's a pretty gruesome way to go.
It is.
Yeah.
But it's also, nature is full of these kinds of relationships
Absolutely.
where there's this, one organism that's benefiting at the expense of another.
It's a really important part
Yeah.
of keeping populations in check.
Right.
Yeah,
And it's also a really important source of food for other animals.
absolutely. So within Ichneumonidae,
Right.
there are a lot of different life history strategies,
Okay.
and they can be categorized based on how they attack their host
Oh.
and how they develop.
Okay.
So, for example, many Pimplinae
Yeah.
are what we call idiobiont ectoparasitoids.
Idiobiont ectoparasitoids.
Yes.
Right.
And that means that they attack their host, they either kill it or permanently paralyze it,
Right.
and then they lay their eggs on the outside of the host's body.
Okay.
And the larva feeds on the outside of the host's body.
So the larva is outside
Yeah.
eating its way in.
Yes.
Okay.
And the host is either dead or paralyzed.
Wow.
Yeah. So another group are idiobiont endoparasitoids.
Endoparasitoids.
Yes.
Okay.
And so they do the same thing in terms of killing or paralyzing the host.
Right.
But then they lay their eggs inside the host's body.
Wow. Okay.
And the larva develops inside the host's body.
Interesting.
Yeah.
And then there are also koinobiont parasitoids.
Koinobiont parasitoids.
Yeah.
And these are the ones that allow their host to continue living and growing
Okay.
for at least a while
Okay.
while the larva is feeding on it.
Wow.
And these can be either ectoparasitoids or endoparasitoids.
So the host is still alive,
Yeah.
but it's got this, parasite feeding on it.
Yeah, and the host can actually continue
Right.
to grow and develop,
Wow.
which is pretty amazing.
Yeah, that's incredible.
Yeah. And then there's a group called the Polysphincta genus group.
Okay. That are koinobiont ectoparasitoids of spiders.
So they lay their eggs on the outside of a spider,
Yeah.
and the spider's still alive.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
And the larva's just like eating away at it.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
So how do Darwin wasps actually find their hosts?
Well, that's another really interesting aspect of their biology.
Okay.
Some of them use vibrational sounding.
Vibrational sounding?
Yeah.
What's that? So they can actually tap on the substrate
Oh.
and then listen for the vibrations that are reflected back.
Oh, yeah.
And they can use that to detect the presence of a host.
So they're kind of like using echolocation.
Yeah, it's kind of like echolocation.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah.
And then once they find their host,
Mm-hmm.
how do they lay their eggs?
Well, they have this really cool structure called an ovipositor,
Okay.
which is basically a modified egg-laying tube.
Okay.
And it can be really long
Okay.
and thin.
Okay.
And they can use it to pierce through wood or even through the exoskeleton of another insect
Wow.
to lay their eggs.
And they can control like where they lay their eggs?
Yeah,
Like they can make sure that they lay their eggs in the right spot on the host.
exactly.
Wow, that's amazing.
Yeah. And there's been some research that has shown that they can actually steer their ovipositor
Wow.
as they're inserting it into the host.
Wow, that's incredible.
Yeah, so they can make sure that they lay their eggs in just the right spot.
Wow. So we've talked about the diversity of Darwin wasps and their biology.
Yeah.
Now let's get into their taxonomy.
Okay.
How are they classified?
Well, the taxonomy of Ichneumonidae is constantly evolving
Okay.
as new species are discovered and
Yeah.
as we learn more about their evolutionary relationships.
Right.
But there are some sort of basic groupings that have been
Mhm.
established. So the family is divided into subfamilies,
Right.
and then the subfamilies are divided into tribes.
Okay.
And then the tribes are divided into genera, and then the genera are divided into species.
Okay.
And there's been a lot of work done on the taxonomy of Ichneumonidae,
Okay.
but there's still a lot more to do.
Yeah, it sounds like a very complex field.
It is.
And are there any recent discoveries in Ichneumonidae taxonomy that you can tell us about?
Well, there's been a new genus described from India
Okay.
called Saliga,
Okay.
and there's also been a revision of the genus Ischrocnemus,
Okay.
which led to the resurrection.
The resurrection.
Yeah, they brought back
Right.
an old genus called Pterozoa.
Wow.
Yeah,
So it sounds like there's a lot of exciting research going on in Ichneumonidae taxonomy.
absolutely.
Yeah. Now, switching gears a bit, what can you tell us about the ecological factors that influence Darwin wasps?
Well, there are a lot of factors that can influence Darwin wasp populations.
Okay.
For example, the availability of hosts
Right.
is obviously very important.
Right. If they don't have hosts to lay their eggs on, they're not going to be able to reproduce.
Exactly. And then the climate can also be important.
Uh-huh.
Some species are more tolerant of cold temperatures than others.
Okay.
And then the habitat can also be important.
Okay.
Some species are more specialized in their habitat requirements than
Oh.
others.
Okay. And how do these factors actually play out in terms of the distribution of Darwin wasps?
Well, one study that we've already talked about a little bit
Right.
looked at the elevational distribution of Pimplinae wasps
Okay.
in the Brazilian Atlantic rainforest.
Right.
And they found that the abundance, richness, and diversity of Pimplinae wasps all peaked.
Peaked.
Yeah, they were highest
Okay.
at low to intermediate elevations,
Interesting.
and then they decreased at higher elevations.
So it's like a Goldilocks zone for Darwin wasps.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. And what do you think is driving that pattern?
Well, it's probably a combination of factors.
Okay.
But one possibility is that it's related to the availability of hosts. So it could be that the hosts that these wasps parasitize are more abundant
Okay.
at lower to intermediate elevations.
Okay, so there's just more food available for them at those elevations.
Exactly. And then another possibility is that it's related to the climate.
Okay.
So it could be that the temperatures at higher elevations are just too cold
Right.
for these wasps to survive.
Okay.
Yeah. And then the researchers also looked at the community composition.
Community composition.
Yeah, so the different species that were present
Right.
at different elevations.
Okay.
And they found that there was a significant change in community composition.
So the types of wasps that you find are
Sure.
different at different elevations.
Yeah.
Okay. And what do you think is driving that?
Well, again, it's probably a combination of factors.
Yep.
But one possibility is that it's related to the different host species
Right.
that are present at different elevations.
Okay.
So the wasps that are specialized on certain host species are only going to be found at the elevations where those host species are present.
Right. That makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay. So what are the conservation implications of all of this?
Well, the study suggests that conserving low to mid-altitude forests
Okay.
might be the most effective way to protect pimplinate wasps,
Right.
because that's where they're most abundant and diverse.
Okay.
However, it's also important to protect a range of altitudes
Right.
because different species are found at different elevations.
Right.
So if you only protect one altitude, you're going to miss out on a lot of species.
So it's important to protect the entire ecosystem.
Yeah,
Right.
absolutely.
Yeah.
And the researchers also found that some vegetation variables were correlated with pimpline reversity.
Okay.
So, for example, they found that lower amounts of herb ground cover
Okay.
and higher densities of epiphytes.
Lepophytes.
Yeah, those are plants that grow on other plants,
Okay.
like orchids and bromeliads. They found that those were associated with higher diversity of pimplinate wasps.
Interesting. So it's not just about protecting the forest.
Yeah,
It's about protecting the right kind of forest.
exactly.
Okay. Well, this has been a really fascinating discussion.
Yeah.
Thanks for sharing your expertise with us.
You're welcome.
And I think it's really important to remember that even these seemingly small creatures,
Yeah,
like Darwin wasps, can play a really important role in the ecosystem.
absolutely. They're really important for keeping populations in check
Right.
and for maintaining biodiversity.
Right. And they're also just really cool.
Yeah.
So if you're ever out in the woods, keep an eye out for them.
Yeah.
You might be surprised at what you see.
Absolutely.
So for all of you listeners out there, be sure to like, subscribe, and share this episode of the All Sorts podcast with your friends.
Yes.
We've got a ton of other great episodes in our back catalog, so be sure to check those out as well.
Yeah. And you can follow us on X, Instagram, and Threads.
Yeah, for more behind-the-scenes content and updates.
Yeah.
Thanks for listening.